tape is on Paul Cézanne, C-E-Z-A-N-N-E. Put in the first slide, please. In the cemetery of Saint-Pierre near Aix-en-Provence, in southern France, lies the grave of Paul Cézanne. Beyond the grave to the north is the undulating line of the Étoile Hills, and farther still, rising blue in the clear provincial air, is the mountain called Sainte-Victoire. A visitor walking this country knows at once that this was created by Cézanne. The bleached outcroppings of rock, the swiftly slanting forest of pine, the aromatic scrub, the limpid sky, the long roll and pitch of the land, all of this and more, Cézanne fixed on canvas so compellingly that to visit the country after experiencing his paintings is to see with Cézanne's eyes and to feel with Cézanne's lonely temper. It was Cézanne who discerned the genius of this landscape, celebrated its forms and color, and revealed in it a profundity that no eye before his had ever seen. Yet a visitor soon becomes aware that what lies before his eyes is not, after all, what Cézanne put on canvas. Cézanne's Provence is simpler and more structural than the country that inspired it. Things in the paintings that should be far away seem near, and forms in the foreground are presented as if they lay at an indefinable distance. The colors are the colors of Provence, but when the visitor stands where Cézanne presumably stood with his easel and looks across the country, he will not necessarily find the colors Cézanne painted in the sequence in which he painted them. Everything is clarified and concentrated. The power of Cézanne's to convey the essence of a landscape while eliminating much of its detail tells us a great deal about the man and his works. The simplest and truest things that can be said of him is that he taught the world to see in a new way. He was not interested, as many of the academic painters of his day were, in reproducing the visible world with photographic exactitude. Nor was he interested, as his contemporaries, the Impressionists were, in recording the passing effects of nature. Cézanne believed that in the natural world there were enduring forms and colors and enduring relationships between them. As a result, Cézanne will be to the 20th century what Giotto was to the 14th. In the painting that is on the screen now, we have a typical example of Cézanne's Impressionist period. It embodies all the characteristics that were so important to Cézanne's work, portraying the nature as he saw it and as he revitalized it in a more solid geometric form. Cézanne always felt, still being attached to the Renaissance idea of presenting the visual world as you, the viewer, would see it yourself, was still tied to the Renaissance tradition, or a classical tradition, of presenting this visual world. And yet, he understood that his canvas plane was a two-dimensional surface. So he fought this battle between presenting the visual world and yet retaining the honesty of a two-dimensional surface of the canvas. Slide, please. His early works, from around 1860 to 1862, and it is difficult to assign any certain years to Cézanne's work. He never dated his canvases, so it's only through photographs, sketches, diaries, or letters that we can assign dates or sort of a period of dates to any of the certain paintings. But we do know from the different influences that happened to him in the different parts of his life, we can assign paintings to about 3 different stages. The early one, which, as I said, was from about 1860 to 1872, were sort of dark, violent, aggressive paintings. The color scheme is not that of the Impressionists. It's much more of the earlier Renaissance artists. In the south of France, in Aix-en-Provence, where the sun is blindingly harsh during the day, houses are shuttered, enclosed, and it seems sort of an antithesis that outside the blinding light, the inside of the homes were kept very dark during the day. But through the shutters on the windows, streaks of light would appear, and they appear even brighter, being against a darker background. Slide, please. In this one, an early one, again around the 1860s, it's called The House of the Hanged Man. Cézanne is introducing his strength in composition. Cézanne said that everything, every object, every person, all landscapes should be reduced to geometric forms. Not flat geometric or simple geometry, but solid geometric forms. Everything can be reduced to a cone, a cylinder, or a cube. In his structure, he then sort of violates the true perspective of things, so that even in this painting, you have this strong element of almost like a puzzle, where the pieces solidly fit together, filling the two-dimensional surface of the canvas. He felt to get this relief in paintings, where one thing would stand out from another, that even the application of paint was very thick, of actually with a painting knife, of slathering the paint on, of building up the paint in textures, as you see in this painting, that he would actually build three-dimensionally from the canvas, although very slight, the difference of objects and planes, and this is especially true in early still lifes. Slide, please. It wasn't until about the 1870s that he met another great Impressionist painter, Camille Pissarro, and sort of adulated him almost in a godlike form. Pissarro introduced the use of the Impressionist color to Cézanne. And then Cézanne sort of enters then the middle period of his work, of where he sort of assimilates some of the Impressionist techniques, some of the Impressionist use of color, where the color becomes lighter, brighter, not quite so dark and dismal as in his earlier period. And then he works up in this broken strokes of form, which become very much a characteristic of his painting, of where each little jab of paint would be applied very carefully, but to give a spontaneity to the painting that you would not have if you blended the colors together. The subject matter, and I'm keeping all the landscapes together, then we'll see his portraits and his still lifes in a separate series. But I think it's sort of important to see the artist's development of one subject area. But in this, even though there feels to be an underlying darkness of color, with these brilliant little patches of color, these strokes, these diagonal strokes that he places on the canvas, the strength of Cézanne's compositions lies in the geometric forms of the composition. You have basically layers here, from the road down, from the road up to the bottom of the houses, a horizontal band of the houses, and then another horizontal band of the sky. The houses with their red tile roofs, their white stuccoed walls, and their sort of punctuated or accentuated openings that sort of reveal the darkness of the interiors of the room, that separate and point out the flatness of the facade or the sides of the building. Slide, please. And this was, his father was a hat maker who became quite wealthy, of bourgeois class, rising, wealthy, middle class people, and then became the banker at Aix-en-Provence. He was a fairly wealthy man. He did not appreciate Cézanne's interest in the art world, but he put up with it, thinking that every gentleman should have the knowledge of the fine arts as part of his background. This was their home that Cézanne painted. Again, if you see how geometrically or abstractedly the composition is set up, you see again the horizontal bands of the landscape in the lower portion, the buildings in the middle, and then the sky across the top. You can simplify Cézanne's compositions into these simple geometric forms. Slide, please. In this one, an unfinished canvas, and many of Cézanne's canvases were left unfinished. He was criticized for this, although he was sort of a lonely person, temper. There was even one story that the little children in Provence threw rocks at him one time. He was just really not understood, not only by the populace, but by the critics too, that criticized him harshly on the paintings that he exhibited with the Impressionist group in 1874, the last time. He did not always exhibit with the Impressionists, but in their early shows. But in this one, he left a lot of the canvas left uncovered. You have a sort of a driving motion, of upward motion, from the slant of the houses all the way up to the bell tower that's in the top of the church at the top of the painting. But it gives us really a good idea of how he started his paintings. You can see the squiggly lines of the drawing, the original sketch, especially in the trees in the lower right-hand corner of this painting. You can see how he tied together all of these patches of paint with an outlining, cutting edge on the edges of the building and of the roofs, and then of how he would start applying the paint in the trees and the sort of squiggling patches that would make the trees sort of alive and jump within the composition. Slide, please. This is also, that's Mount Saint-Victoire in the background, and you'll see that he uses the sort of pyramidal shape of the mountain a lot in many of his paintings. But it's broken up. He observes nature, and he changes nature to his own uses. Slide, please. This is a much later one, sort of toward the end of his life. He died in 1906. He was born in 1839. Where they become very abstract. They're just, you no longer have as the feeling of the solidity as you have when he outlines his things, as toward the end of his life, when they really become patches of color in a very abstract application over the surface of the canvas. But you still have sort of the colors. You always have the indication of sort of that rusty red of the tile roofs. You almost have a feeling that there are some forms where the rock shapes become almost house forms. But there would be dealings with the nature. Slide, please. He very seldom put people in his canvases. He felt like they would distract from the simple basis of the landscape itself. Slide, please. And this is so typical of how he builds up the tall pine trees in the south of France. He liked to use this diagonal stroke. It is almost sort of a natural angle that his hand would take. You automatically know that he was a right-handed person because all the angles go from the top down toward the left-hand side. Each little dab of paint would be applied, and then colors mixed and other applications of paint put on. And then he would always come back with these cutting lines, as you can see sort of on the edges of the trees, to designate them and to pull them out in that relief of pulling the trunks forward, that he wanted those to sort of jump out at you, and then the darker colors to push things back into the background. Slide, please. In seeing so many of Cézanne's works, it sort of gives you an idea over and over again of his love of that certain area. He did not travel very much, where we think that many of the artists traveled all over Europe. Cézanne basically divided his time between Paris and Aix. Aix is spelled A-I-X, Aix-en-Provence. It's in the south of France near Marseille. Slide. And again, a later painting of Mount Saint-Victoire in the cool blues. And you have, again, this sort of horizontal bands as he laid out his composition of where each area would sort of fit into the next area. Slide, please. He was a boyhood friend of Emile Zola, who was a famous writer of the period. And Cézanne himself thought of becoming a writer first. There are a few examples of his early poetry. Slide, please. As he works with the strokes on the trees on the left, you see them in the diagonal pattern, and then they're more vertical as you move across, and then in the reflections of his water, whereas most of the Impressionists, like Monet with his water lilies, would give you a transparency in the water, where you would see the reflections of the clouds and you'd see beyond the water lilies. In Cézanne's work, you almost have a density, like the water is opaque. You do not have a translucency or a transparency in Cézanne's water. Even though they're reflections, the brush strokes change. He does work in more horizontal strokes, but even showing the reflections in the water of the vertical strokes. Slide, please. And then a close-up, as you can see the detailing of the little house that was in the far left of that composition. The bridge would then be over to the far left in this painting. The paint was fairly thin at this point of the Impressionist period. It would be applied, but then a lot of the canvas left uncovered. Slide, please. In a finished, of the Impressionist period, in a finished painting such as this, you really have a feeling of solidity in Cézanne's work. In Renoir's backgrounds, where he used the landscape, they were sort of filmy, feathery things. Monet's, the shape, the flat shape, was much more important. In Cézanne's work, you have a much more emotional feeling to the presentation. I think we will find him much more in tune with, say, Van Gogh, that we will study later on, of where the solidity of the composition is more important than, say, the surface of the composition was to, say, Renoir or Monet. But you have the breaking up, the patches of color, you have the direction of the brush stroke, you have the bands of abstract quality that go across the composition, you have the houses with their little dark windows, the red rooftops, and then always the sort of cutting outline. Not the whole thing outlined, but accented on the edges. Slide, please. Cézanne is considered a post-impressionist. Even though he was influenced by Pissarro and the other impressionists, he took their, as I've mentioned, in this feeling of geometry, of where everything, especially in his still lifes, were solid geometric forms. He took Impressionism a step further. And that is why, along with Van Gogh and Seurat, where his technique became more important, that he is considered a post-impressionist. Slide, please. As you can see, some of the ones, we're jumping back and forth a little bit in time here. The freer ones are of the later period of time. Most of his paintings, his great paintings, were done from about 1890 to 1895. He did, in the last decade of his life, over 150 landscapes, not including the portraits and still lifes, and then a lot of watercolors of where he would work the idea out in watercolor first. Slide, please. This is one of the bridges that we've seen from different angles. It's a fairly dense, shaded area. But stone bridges, and then the reflection of the water. The oval on the left-hand side is the reflection of the arch. Look how nice and broad the strokes are in the trees in the upper portion of the painting. Slide, please. In Cézanne's studying, he was not accepted in the School of the Beaux-Arts in Paris and went to another, the Académie of Suisse, which was a more progressive, probably more fortunate for Cézanne. But he did fairly academic studies from the model in class until he sort of broke up, and he continually used these early sketches for some of his great compositions later on where he included the figure. Slide, please. Broad slashing strokes, but very solid, of where dark would meet light. Slide, please. There were quite a few of the valley by Mont Saint-Victoire, and also within this valley, and you just see a bare portion of it over on the far right, was a Roman aqueduct. And this was included in many of the compositions that he did from this same vantage point, all slightly different. Slide, please. In this, where he's moved around behind the pine trees, and you look down over the valley, and you can see very definitely in this painting the aqueduct with the arches, and then the mountain peak coming between the strong vertical lines of the pine trees. Slide, please. And also this one that's done in a more delicate rendition in color and in treatment, but still in the mountain and the aqueduct. He never decided on a composition as Seurat did, of where he built the composition on a theme. But many times, he thinks of the composition in abstract terms of certain angles, certain lines, like vertical and diagonal lines. Slide, please. Looking across the water to the island of Lestat, the houses are built up, and especially on a hillside where you do not have streets laid out in nice, neat form, where every house would go to the same vanishing point. It's sort of where he takes the view, the natural view as you would see it, and yet it becomes unnatural because all the houses are at different angles, so that you're looking down to them, and it makes a very active composition of where everything then is sort of aiming toward a different vanishing point. You still have the same horizon line, but a lot of different vanishing points. Slide, please. Another painting from the same general area. Slide, please. Slide, please. And as it loosens up from the tightness of the early ones to where it is really patches of color with just suggestion of architecture in the landscape. Slide, please. This one was done in 1905, a year before his death. Slide, please. Slide, please. And even with all the strokes and different angles of the strokes and the paint and patches, with very seldom that it's ever blended, you still have a feeling of great strength to Cézanne's work. Slide, please. This is a portrait of Madame Cézanne, who was sort of a country woman, not very stylish, not very pretty, as you can see here too, very plain, but in her patient way, patiently sat hour upon hour for her husband to paint her. This one is owned by the Museum of Fine Arts here in Houston, and it's not a large painting, it's sort of average size. There's a photograph of Cézanne with his traveling kit, his paint box, his canvas is rolled up, trudging down the road. So we know not until later that in his Bather series, where he worked on a very large scale. Most of his paintings, this is probably 24 by 30 inches or something like this, and it is one of the most prized paintings in the museum collection. It is thinly painted. You can walk up to it and you can sort of see, of course, the canvas, the priming on the canvas has aged since Cézanne has painted this. So instead of the glaring white canvas left showing, as it was in his own day, the canvas is sort of mellowed, so it's sort of a neutral tone, and you really don't notice it as much today as you would have 100 years ago. Again, he has a sort of bluish drawing line like around the collar, of where he outlines, he defines the shape and defines the form. I was very interested in this painting. I've kept looking at over the years, and it is not signed, so we do not know if he intended it to be finished or if he still thought of working on it after a while. But on the right eye that you see in this photograph, it's sort of smudgy in comparison to the left eye as you look at it. And there were even some sort of scratch lines, like 3 or 4 scratch lines, like he had taken the end of his brush and had sort of redrawn something and had intended to change that part of the composition. I was surprised to find, the last time I was at the museum, that they have restored those scratches. They have filled it in so that you don't see the scratches anymore. And I asked the registrar at the museum why they did that, because if Cézanne had done it himself, that's the way he intended it to be, and it should not be changed by anybody else. Even though we know that Rembrandts were varnished with yellow varnishes to make them more golden. We know, like in the El Greco we saw, that drapery was painted over figures or figures changed. We know that people do change paintings over the years. But in doing the studies of this, they were not sure if Cézanne had done that or if it had been done at a later time, that they were mars or scratches that had been put in on the painting. So anyway, they decided, if you look in the light, you can still see the indent of the scratch there in the canvas. But from a distance now, her eye looks a lot better than it did. Slide, please. And in this one, another portrait of Madame Cézanne. Again, the very plain study. This one with her hands just barely sketched in with the original sort of turpentine wash of the paint. And then the strong angles in the background. You find pieces of their household or some plant forms or flowers in the composition. But the background becomes very abstract. It does not create the atmosphere that you would normally find in a portrait. Slide, please. He did several paintings based on the theme of the card players. And this is where, since they're not portraits, they're just models posing. And he really worked, he loved these sort of bowler hats because they became the cone shapes or the cylinder shapes that he liked. And the whole man on the left-hand side, like the arm is a cylinder shape, the forearm is a cylinder shape, the head and the hat become spherical shapes, so that all the bodies become very solid because they are based on solid geometric forms. Also, in the application of paint, he changes the lines of the table and the perspective of the angle at the table so that you're looking down at the two players. He also did a portrait of the man on the left who's smoking the pipe. But you have a very feeling of thick cloth in that the cloth is not a lightweight cloth, it's a very heavy cloth because it doesn't sag. The weight of the cloth does not crease it down to the edge of the table. Slide, please. This was one of the first Cézannes that really brought a high price at auction. The Guggenheim Museum bought it when Mr. James Johnson Sweeney was its director. And it's just called A Simple Boy in a Red Vest, where he would have had a model, and the title was just sort of a cataloging title without any meaning. But you have all of these marvelous geometric shapes. You have this sort of funny white shape on the right that juts in on the right-hand side of the canvas that balances the very white of the slashing of the wrinkles in the sleeve of the model. Then you have again sort of the repetition in a reverse of this little white shape of the shape in the background behind the head. The face is not really modeled, it's not shaded, although there is some shading on the right-hand side, but basically it is a drawn face over the surface. This painting at the time was, I think, the most expensive price ever paid for a painting. And this was, 25 years ago, and it brought over $500,000. Of course, in the art market today, where paintings are going for multi-million, you really wouldn't know what a good Cézanne would bring on today's market. Although I think he is not nearly as popular as, say, Picasso or Van Gogh. He does not, or his life does not catch the imagination as much as the life of Van Gogh's would have. Slide, please. This is a self-portrait of what he looked. He did quite a few self-portraits from early ages, not as many as Rembrandt or probably as Van Gogh, but he used himself as model. Slide, please. This is his son, Paul. I think he sort of looks, he must have taken after his mother, I do believe. Slide, please. And again, Madame Cézanne. Slide, please. And one of the card player models, still with the pipe. But it's this breaking up of the surface and the application of paint that makes Cézanne's paintings so vibrant and alive. Slide, please. This is a portrait of Emile Zola. Zola's family came on hard times as a young man, and then before he gained literary fame, he then became very wealthy, and he was a great influence on Cézanne. He kept Cézanne from leaving Paris several times, trying to keep him in painting. Slide, please. One series that was entirely different, but of a monumental effect, was the figure in nature. And Cézanne did the bathers. He did several of the male figures, which he said he had remembered from when his friends as youths would go to the river and go bathing. And then he did in the more classical vein of the female figures in the outdoors. But he really wanted to try the effect of fitting the figure within the landscape so that they would not feel isolated but become part of the landscape. And these paintings became quite large, probably 8 to 10 feet. He found it just physically very difficult to move the painting out of doors. And this was very important because the Impressionists worked out of doors. They did not work in the studio. Slide, please. And many of these figures were based on the classical studies that he had done as a young student in Paris, that he would go to his old sketchbooks and bring out some of the studies that he had done from paintings of Rubens, and Delacroix especially was the favorite one of his. Slide, please. The last group you'll see are his still lifes, and this is a very early one, the Black Clock. It is owned by the Greek Stavros Niarchos in Paris in his collection. It once belonged to a movie star, Edward G. Robinson, who had an extremely fine collection of Impressionist work. He was one of the first of the Hollywood clan to start very seriously collecting art. And after his death, it was sold then in auction. But this is where the paint is slathered on, where the paint is heavy. The objects are solid. He contrasts light against dark. This would be in the first period again, from 1860 to 1872. Slide, please. And then this one, which is a very important one, of where he destroys perspective, of where he takes the still life objects and then facets them like a diamond on a surface, and then pulls a little line to hold all these facets together. The objects, again, you have about 3 planes. The fairly plain area of the white drape in the foreground. You have the more busy, colorful area band through the middle of the fruit, and then you have the simplified, the drapery in the background in the upper level. But he takes these shapes and sort of lifts the table up a little bit. In true perspective, all of these objects roll off the edge of the table. But he allows you to look down on them, of where everything is sort of tucked in its place. And again, with these spherical forms, he loved to do apples because they were nearly spherical. But then he would break up the surface and then tie them all together with these little outlines. The drape is unfinished. It almost allows the busy part of the drape to be toward the center part of the painting so that it is in pattern with the rest of the fruit. And then the unfinished part of the drapery again sort of repeats the calm, flatter area at the top that you would have in the bottom area of the towel or the drape that is coming out over the edge of the table. Slide, please. The blue vase, and look how he works in the background again. These sort of abstract forms, these lines, there could be indications of architecture or window or a pattern or a wall, but they're not that important. What they're doing is they're breaking up the space in the background. Notice also on the blue vase how defined it is by this sort of blurry, glowing blue line that's around it. And that purpose is to really set it off from the background. You define the shape. It's in relief of where the vase comes forward and the plate and the table push back into the background. Slide, please. We see the compote again in the bowl of apples with the crumpled cloth. The same almost floral pattern in the background, which could have been wallpaper or a piece of drapery. Slide, please. And again the compote with the fruit piled up like masses of rocks in the foreground, colored. The heavier paint, the texture applied in the strokes as his arm would move down on the painting. Slide, please. And this certainly, where the edges of the table are not in correct perspective, but where he lifts it up so that it sort of makes you nervous in looking at one of the still lifes. It's not picture element of the still life itself, but it becomes something different, of where you know it looks real, but it could not be real. It is not in a real situation. Even the selection of pots that he uses, again, repeat the spherical shape that he liked to use. Slide, please. And the same still life from a different angle. We've seen the little pot before, the large pot with the raffia banding around it. Slide, please. Slide, please.